Hey Bunnies, it's Tracy. I want to share a book with you today called Marcel the Pastry Chef by Marianna Mayer, illustrated by Gerald McDermott. Let's get to it. Uncle Marcel became famous thanks to his wonderful cream puffs. It all happened when he was young. He worked in the king's kitchen, cleaning pots all day long. But what he wanted most in the world was to bake delicious pastries. The king's cook wouldn't hear of it. "Who ever heard of a hippopotamus baking pastry? You must clean the pots," said the cook, scowling at poor Marcel. From early morning till late at night, Marcel worked at the sink, cleaning pot after pot. But when everyone else was fast asleep, Marcel would creep quietly back to the kitchen and practice his pastry making. He made eclairs, Napoleons, and flaky butter rolls with chocolate inside. Then, of course, he would have to eat them all, so the cook would not find out. After hours and hours of long practice, Marcel became the best pastry chef in the land, but no one knew it. One night, Marcel forgot one of his cream puffs. He had made 16, and without counting, he had eaten all of them except one. He was very full, and it was getting close to daybreak. Marcel hurried to clean up his mess, and soon forgot all about the last cream puff. That night, the king tossed and turned in his royal bed. He couldn't sleep, and he seemed to sniff sweet baking smells that made him hungry indeed. At last, he could stand it no longer. He got up out of bed and put on his royal slippers and his royal bathrobe. He tiptoed down to the kitchen to get something to eat. Down in the kitchen, Marcel heard someone coming, and, thinking it must be the cook, he rushed away to his own room. He had not time to make a final check of the kitchen for stray crumbs or cream puffs. When the king came in, he saw a lovely cream puff sitting all alone on the table. "Now why didn't the cook give me this cream puff if he knows how to make them?" wondered the king. "I never would have thought that the cook could bake so well," said the king with his mouth full of cream. My, this is uncommonly good. And to think that the cook said he didn't bake. Well, this shall be our little secret." The king ate every bit, wiped his mouth, tiptoed back to his royal bed, and went straight to sleep. Meanwhile, Marcel sat in his bed with the covers over his head. Suddenly he remembered the last cream puff. He crept back down to the kitchen, only to discover that the cream puff was gone. Marcel didn't sleep a wink that night. He was very worried the next morning when he saw the cook. He expected that the cook would turn him out, but the cook said nothing whatever about the cream puff and seemed to be in a very good mood. Marcel couldn't know that the reason the cook was in such a good mood was because the king had sent him a gold coin with his compliments. The secret was safe. Nothing more was said about the cream puff. Marcel longed to share his pastries. He began to think that since somebody had obviously eaten his cream puff, and that since he hadn't been scolded for baking it, he should continue to bake, leaving a little something behind in the kitchen each night, which is exactly what he did. And each night the king came down to the kitchen and helped himself to a new and marvelous confection. Everything went along very well for a time. The king was happy and the cook was happy because the king continued to send him gold coins and had even taken to winking at the cook in a knowing way whenever they happened to meet. But all good things eventually come to an end, even if they just lead to other good things. One day a proclamation was sent out that the king and queen's daughter, Princess Esmeralda, was to be married. The king summoned the cook and told him to bake the very best wedding cake that had ever been made. "But your majesty, you know I don't bake." "It's not in my contract," said the worried cook. The king smiled. "Tut, tut, you are being modest. You and I know better than that," he said, beginning to wink. "Your Royal Highness, it's quite impossible," said the cook, sniveling. "Don't worry, I know you'll do a fine job. Besides, I command it, and so does the queen. Don't forget those delicious cream puffs, my boy," added the king, continuing to wink, which completely confused the cook and left him thinking that the king must have gotten a bit of grit in his royal eye. The cook returned to the kitchen in a terrible state of panic. He shouted at Marcel to make himself feel better and immediately began to bake. His first attempt produced a cake that would not rise. At his second attempt, his cake burned. His next 4 attempts did not fare any better than the last 2. At last, at midnight, a poor example of a cake sat finished before the cook. Exhausted, he left the kitchen and went straight to bed. Marcel was left to clean the many pots and pans the cook had used to make his terrible cakes. When Marcel was finished, he looked with pity upon the cook's lopsided and lumpy wedding cake. Marcel began to bake. He baked like he'd never baked before. When he finished, there was a wedding cake of 17 layers, one for each birthday the princess had celebrated. The frosting was pink with red rosebuds made of sugar. There was, of course, whipped cream between the layers, and the lovely cake stood taller than Marcel himself. The next day, the cook did not get out of bed. Instead, he hid in his room, waiting to be summoned by the king. At the same time, the royal waiters carried in the perfect wedding cake to the wedding party. Oh, the cheers when everyone saw it! Oh, the shouts of joy when they began to eat! When the cook was finally summoned by the king, the frightened cook nearly fainted as the king embraced him and kissed him on both cheeks. Peace reigned in the kitchen once more, and Marcel continued to bake in the wee hours before dawn. And one night the king crept down to the kitchen earlier than usual, only to discover Marcel stuffing Pastry with whipped cream. The rest is history. Again, nothing stays the same for long. Marcel could not deny he was responsible for all the wonderful pastries the king had come to love. The cook was given the task of washing pots, and Marcel was elevated to the position of the king's royal pastry chef. The king even insisted on a bed made of baked pastry dough and an armoire made of the same delightful and delicious material. In Marcel's spare moments, he kindly taught the cook the art of baking, which, eventually, the cook did learn, but not without some difficulty. When Marcel retired, he opened his own pastry shop. People came from everywhere to buy Marcel's baked goods. In time, of course, Uncle Marcel was called out of retirement to rescue the domain, but that's another story. The end. I hope you guys really enjoyed this book about Marcel. I know I did. I'll see you guys soon.